Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm Sally Gango with College Coach. We'll be discussing some really timely topics today. During segment 2, we'll hold office hours on whether and when students should submit their SAT or ACT scores. So I know a lot of students have been asking me questions about that. I'll be discussing that with Ryan Kelly, who's a newbie here at College Coach. We're really glad to have him. Previously worked at Boulder, Colorado University at Boulder, and Fordham University. For segment 3, Kira Tyler, who's a College Coach veteran. You've definitely heard her on the show before. And I will be discussing the University of Chicago supplemental essay questions. So that should be a fun one, gets its own full segment, which most colleges don't. But for the first segment, any of you who are actually watching this instead of just listening to it, you'll see Chrissy Foran, a member of our College Coach finance team, and she will be profiling the CSS profile. Welcome, Chrissy.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate letting me be here today.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Our pleasure. I really enjoy these finance units because these are the ones where I am the most clueless, like absolutely know almost nothing. So it's been very helpful for me in my calls. So let's start though with what is the CSS profile? I mean, I knew what it was because I went to a college that required it, but I know most colleges don't use it, right?
Correct. And I talked to a lot of parents too that, they're ready to file the FAFSA, the other application, but not many parents have heard of the CSS profile. And that is because not a lot of schools use it. But basically it's the CSS profile stands for College Scholarship Service Profile. Mm-hmm. So it's another financial aid application that about 250 undergraduate institutions ask for across the nation. Most of those schools are private schools, but there are some public schools that ask for it too. So it was actually created by the College Board, who also administers the SAT tests, if parents have heard of those. So it's not a federal application, it's not a state application, it's more just a private application that these colleges use. It's an online application, and what they basically use it for is to determine a student's eligibility for non-federal financial aid. So schools will use it to determine who gets really their own institutional grants and scholarships. So it's not used for any federal funding or any state funding, it's all just for the institution itself. So these schools will use this application in conjunction with the FAFSA. So they use them both. They use the FAFSA to determine if a student's eligible for any federal or state aid. And then they use the CSS profile to determine any institutional eligibility. Like I said, most schools that use it are private schools. So there are a few public, but it's a much more in-depth application than the FAFSA. It goes a lot deeper into your finances. It asks a lot more questions. A lot of them are similar, but it's just another application that parents need to be thinking about depending on where their kids are applying to school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, generally if they're applying public, they probably won't need it, but private, they might.
Yeah, some of the more highly selective public schools or schools that have really large endowments end up using it just so that they can give their money to the students who need it the most. But by and large, it's typically private schools, and they're across the nation now too. So they're in California, they're on the East Coast, they're in the Midwest. So most schools across the nation, you just want to make sure you're checking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just more fun.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine how much fun you have filling out your taxes, and then think about this application. Actually, when I filled out the FAFSA for graduate school, I will say that I thought it was easier than the California state tax form. So
that's gotten very simplified, which is great.
Yeah, that was nice. All right. So does it cost money to fill out the profile and submit it?
It does, sadly. Unlike the FAFSA is actually a free application. The CSS profile does charge a fee. So when you go to fill out the application, it's going to ask you for a debit or a credit card. So for the first school that you list on the application, they charge you $25. And then it's $16 for each school that you list after that. And you can list as many schools as you want. They do offer waivers for families. So I think if you make less than about $45,000 a year, you can request a waiver through the CSS Profile website to get out of paying some of those fees. So Make sure you're checking into that too.
I will say I have a bone to pick with them on this. I think that because the waiver is limited, right?
Yeah.
The number of waivers. I mean, isn't it like 4 or something?
Yeah, I don't know the actual amount, but yeah, it can be limited too. So, I mean, those can be fairly difficult to get as well. So,
Yeah.
if you're on a limited income, I think you need to be, choosy as to who you're sending that application to. But again, the good thing is not a ton of schools use it. So hopefully it won't be, every school you apply for.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I get wanting the information.
Right.
I've worked with low income students who make 30,000, and I tell them to apply to more schools so that they can maybe compare aid packages, and then they have to pay, like somehow they have to come up with this money when they barely have lunch money. It's not okay. Anyway, sorry, not the purpose here, but if anybody from the College Board is listening, yeah, probably they aren't, but all right. So how often does this application need to be filled out?
So it's very similar to the FAFSA. Again, there's a lot of similarities between these two. It only needs to be filled out each year of college. So it does open every October 1st, just like the FAFSA does. So if you're a parent of a senior this year, October 1st, next week, actually, you can start filling out the CSS profile. So it's just one time for every year that they're in college.
Okay. And they don't do like a prior kind of thing like the FAFSA. It's just very straightforwardly for the upcoming year.
No, they actually do. So they're going to ask a lot of the same information as the FAFSA. They'll ask for what they call prior. So they're still asking for your 2020 tax information if you're graduating and going to school in the fall of 2022.
Okay. All right. Well, that actually makes it probably easier then. So that's good.
Yeah. A lot of similar stuff.
All right. And so we know that the CSS profile opens on October 1st, but what are the deadlines in terms of when they need to be submitted?
So again, it's really similar to the FAFSA. There's not like one national deadline for any of these financial aid applications. Like with the FAFSA, the CSS profile opens October 1st, but every college is going to have their own deadline for these forms. So you really just want to make sure that you're checking with each of your child's schools to see what those deadlines are. So typically it's usually the same deadline as the FAFSA is. So depending on when that is. So it's just important to check with each of the schools they're applying to number one, make sure that they require or don't require this application, but also to see when everything is due so you don't miss any important deadlines.
Yeah. And definitely get the information directly from the school. I once had a student who missed his opportunity to get aid from Reed because his mother had talked to somebody at University of Florida who said, oh, nobody's using that form. And I was like, we work at Reed, they're University of Florida. Why would you ask them instead of us? Like, you could have called me. Like, Reed is a small enough school. I pick up the phone. They can get a person.
Right. And most often it's listed on the school's website too. So you know, hopefully you don't even need to make a phone call or send an email. You can just search for their financial aid on their website and they should have deadlines there. So
yeah, no, exactly. But I was like, I don't know what to tell you. The aid is gone. It was just not.
Yeah, that's the tough part. Even if you qualify, if it's gone, you don't get it. So
yeah, exactly. Meet the deadline. No flexibility there.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So we've talked, a lot of the questions I've asked have kind of highlighted some similarities, but what are the differences between the CSS profile and the FAFSA?
Yeah, so, and you're right, there are a lot of similarities. They both are going to go by for parents coming with students graduating this coming June, they're looking at your 2020 tax information. So luckily you'll have that for both applications. They ask a lot of the same questions about assets and things, but there are some main differences between these two applications. So for example, if you're a divorced parent, when you're filling out the FAFSA is only going to ask for what they call the custodial parent information, which is typically the parent the child has lived with the most in the last year, or the one that provides more support. So if you're divorced, you're only putting that parent's information on FAFSA and not the other. The CSS profile is going to ask for both the custodial and the non-custodial parent information. So even if you're divorced, you have to have both parents submit information to the form. So that's one really big difference that a lot of families don't seem to know right off the bat. So if you are divorced, that's something to keep in mind. CSS profile unlike the FAFSA, so the FAFSA, when it's asking for your assets, it does not include home equity as an asset on the
Mhm.
FAFSA. The CSS profile does include your home equity.
Mhm.
So they're going to ask questions about how much you owe, how much your mortgage is, what's your house worth, do you have a second mortgage? So that's information that you need for that application that you don't need for the FAFSA. The FAFSA doesn't ask what you have in retirement assets. So retirement assets aren't allowed to be calculated in your financial need on the FAFSA. But again, the CSS profile will ask some separate questions about the value of various retirement accounts that you might have.
Mhm.
The thing, though, that to keep in mind with that is that most colleges and universities, they'll probably only glance at this information. They don't typically include that value of your retirement accounts in their calculation for eligibility,
Mhm.
but they do still ask for it. So the good thing, I guess, about the CSS profile that the FAFSA does not do is it evaluates other things that might be happening in your house, like if you have unusually high medical bills,
Mhm.
you pay private school tuition for younger kids, if the parent themselves still owe student loans back for education. They'll
Mhm.
ask these kinds of questions too, to kind of take into account some of the other expenses you may have. So the FAFSA doesn't ask for any of that. So if you pay private school or have high medical bills, you can't put that on the FAFSA, but you can on the CSS profile. So the thing to really keep in mind is, because this is not a federal application, it is something that's just for institutions. Different schools can use different information from this profile. So your eligibility at one school may not be the same eligibility at another school. So using the divorced family example again, if your parents are divorced, and even though you're providing the non-custodial parent information on that application, some schools won't consider that in their equation, while other schools will. So you can actually see a list of schools on the CSS profile website that use the application number one. There's a list there, but they'll also tell you if they include the custodial, or I'm sorry, the non-custodial parent information in their equation. So this can have a really big difference on your eligibility at different schools. So some colleges also might have some of their own supplemental questions on the application that others don't. So it's just, it's all, just keep that in mind, that, what one school uses, another school may not. So you may have more eligibility somewhere than you do at another school. So it's just kind of take it in stride.
Yeah.
Make sure you're filling it out.
I feel like too, some of the colleges that ask the most questions are the ones that actually give the best aid to.
Mm-hmm.
Like at Chicago, I think we had an extra form, but we gave some great aid to students who were low income. They got much better. They paid far less than they would have at the local public school.
Yeah, and that's precisely why they do ask those questions.
Mhm.
Is they do want to make sure they're giving their scholarships to the neediest students and the
Mhm.
ones that need it the most. And so I mean, it can be a real pain to fill out, and it's a ton of information, but hopefully it can help some of those students too.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So the FAFSA does not allow parents to list any special circumstances on the application, but it sounds like the CSS profile does.
Yeah, it actually does. So the FAFSA is really straightforward. It just very much is saying, hey, what did you earn in this tax year? What are your assets? Do you pay child support? Do you receive child support? So it's asking really basic finance questions. It doesn't allow you to put expenses. It doesn't allow you to ask for special considerations. The CSS profile does actually have a section. It's kind of a note section at the end of the application, where a parent can list any special considerations they want the schools to take into consideration when they're determining their eligibility. So for example, if your income has gone down due to a job loss, during this pandemic, or if you're retiring, soon, and your income doesn't look the same as it did on your tax return, 2 years ago, you can mention that on the CSS profile and actually write a note to say, hey, I have some special circumstances. Or maybe you had a bonus, on that 2020 tax return that really increased your income, and that's not normal. So you can add those kinds of things to the CSS profiles note section. We do recommend submitting a separate letter too to the school's financial aid office if you do have special circumstances. So just to be safe, make sure that they do get all the pertinent information, but you can put that in the application as well. So I would notify the school so that they can look at at information as well as, helping to determine your need. But yeah, so that's the nice thing, is you can put some of that information in there.
Good.
One of the things too is we talk to a lot of parents of, that are divorced, and sometimes the other parent, the non-custodial parent, isn't in the picture. And the CSS profile, obviously some schools request that information. So that's a good spot in the notes to basically say, we don't have contact with the non-custodial parent, or that person's not in the picture, so that we're not providing that information. So.
Okay. How can families prepare for filling out the CSS profile?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So, it is important to remember that not every college is going to use this. So you do want to make sure you're checking with each school's website. That's the first thing I would do, to make sure that, number one, if they ask for it or they're requiring it, and what the deadline is. So you need to know those for all of the schools your child's applying to. Both the FAFSA and the CSS profile are going to ask for tax information from, as you said, the prior year. So it's 2 years basically from the year that your child graduates from high school. So if families have children graduating in this spring of 2022, you should have a tax return from 2020 and your W-2s available. CSS profile can also ask for estimated 2021 income. So the current year that you're in, they can ask you to estimate that income as well, even though you don't have your taxes done. So you might want to have those numbers handy. You also want to have retirement asset information available, as well as any other assets that you have, 529 plans, mutual funds, stocks, stock options, things like that. And then your home equity, your mortgage, you need to have, that information available, and any other assets or bank statements. So if you pay private school tuition amounts, if you have high medical costs, that's good information to be able to have handy for that application as well. The nice thing is the CSS profile has help features that are embedded into the online application to make the process easier, hopefully, because it can be kind of daunting. So they have notes on the left side of the page for any of the sections you're in, so that you know who you're answering the questions for, if it's the student section or the parent section. And you can hover over data elements too to get guidance on how to complete the question. So hopefully it'll make it a little easier to fill out.
Yeah, hopefully. And then where can families find information about the CSS profile?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. College Coach really has, we have great tips about the CSS profile. We have a video series on our Facebook page, or you can search through the YouTube channel for College Coach and CSS profile. You can actually apply for the CSS profile just by visiting the website is cssprofile.collegeboard.org. So that's a great website, like I said, to get a list of the schools that use the CSS profile, find out some of the information that they're requiring or not requiring. You can talk to the schools your child's attending, the financial aid offices too as well. But College Coach is a great resource, so definitely use all of, and this podcast is an amazing thing. So any of those resources I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, actually, when my friends have finance questions and I can't answer those, I send them to our blog and and this podcast. So.
Yeah, it's amazing all the stuff that we have, and when you start kind of looking around, it's like even I'm learning stuff. Just like you said with finance, I learn a lot of admission stuff too, and finance stuff that I just haven't looked at for a while. So it's really
yeah, very handy. All right, thank you so much, Chrissy.
You are so welcome, Sally. Thanks for having me, and have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.
All
right. And now we're going to be taking a short break, but when we return, I'll be talking with Ryan Kelly about whether to submit your test scores to test optional colleges.